Okay, everyone, we're going to be doing our final lecture of week 3 here, and this is about uh, responsible conduct of research. We're going to talk about two things here today, and you can ignore the reminders thing. We'll give you reminders in our synchronous labs. But first, we're going to talk about ethics, and this is going to be followed by the responsibilities that we have to the participants who join our research studies, and then our responsibilities that we have to the field and to our community. Um, so let's kick this off by thinking a little bit about ethics. Um, Ethics is a really hard concept to define. What's morally right and what's morally wrong is tricky. And Philosophers have grappled with this topic for millennia. So just to give you a sense of some ethical conundrums that we might come up with, let's look at the following problem. We've seen this before, the trolley problem. You have the option to pull the lever, which will divert this trolley, which is barreling down the tracks, off toward this single individual, saving five individuals. Yep. And you get to choose, do you pull the lever or not? Of course, both of these situations are bad. And This decision is essentially comes down to how many people do you want to harm? Um, are you going to save the five for the one? Or are you going to withhold pulling the lever? Because that way, you're not culpable for having moved the train. Another way to think about this, and actually usually changes people's choices, um, is using this footbridge dilemma. Um, and here, you are not big enough to stop the train yourself, but you can push this man down onto the tracks, and that will stop the train. This is not my language, by the way. I've taken this from other studies. Does this change the choice for you? Is it psychologically different from pulling a lever, pushing this man? It's the same outcome, right? You're saving five people and harming one. Well, these types of decisions are based in moral philosophy. And one philosophy is this idea of utilitarianism. Um, Something's morally right if it does the most good for the majority. This is kind of like that approach that we tried to take with COVID-19 when we were first learning about it, called herd immunity, where um, if everybody gets it, yes, some may die, but this will ultimately help people. And this is really a bad way to go about COVID-19 because it's a virus and it can mutate. You can just keep getting it again and again. You're not going to build up your immunity to it. Um, Whereas on the other side, we have a deontological approach. Deontological approaches assume that there are true actions that are wrong or right. Or in other words, they'll say things like it's wrong to lie, kill, and steal. Um, and I'll never forget this. When my kids were really young, they were telling me over dinner about uh, why it's always wrong to lie, and I said, "Oh, it's not always wrong to lie. It's sometimes a good thing to lie." I said, "What if Wile E. Coyote, the cartoon character, uh, showed up at our door and he was very hungry and he wanted to eat you?" And I told him, "Oh, the kids are not here today." That would be a lie, right? Said, "Yes, that would be a lie." Um, but it's a good lie because as it kept Wile E. Coyote from harming you. Um, my wife, for some reason, had stepped out of the room while I was telling them all about this over dinner. And when she came back into the room, they were like, "It's okay to lie." And I think I got one of the most stern looks that I've ever seen in my life, but it's a lesson that they needed to learn. Ethics are not that simple. Um, and yeah, so we can start to see some problems with them. But let's turn to a different type of ethics here. This is Aristotle ethics or virtue ethics. And this idea is that we emphasize building our own personal character, rather than any act that you're doing being some kind of duty that you need to perform. You are always asking yourself, is this thing that I'm doing something that a virtuous person would do in my situation? Before you make that decision. This makes me think of Dwight in The Office when he says, before I do anything, I ask myself, would an idiot do this? And if they would, I do not do that thing. Um, so when we're talking about ethics and research, we use just about everything, but most heavily we draw from utilitarian and deontological logic. So how does this look when we are working with participants? You all have probably heard many stories about the unethical things that have been done in research. Um, and one example of this comes from the United States. We've all probably heard of the Tuskegee trials, the syphilis trials. And in this study, this research, it was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service for several decades from the 1930s, and it was stopped in 1972. The idea of the study was to look at the progress of syphilis. And in this study, people weren't actually recruited. That's really not the right word to use here. They were basically involved in the study. 600 Black African American men, 400 of them who had syphilis, and 200 of them who did not. And they were not given informed consent that this study was about the progress of this disease. In fact, they were coerced to stay in the study, basically told that they had bad blood and they were given free special treatments to help them. The the one of the many problems with this study is that there was a treatment available for syphilis since the 1940s. Penicillin was an effective treatment, and these men were not given this treatment. This study aired on the story aired in the press in 1972 about how unethical and morally reprehensible this study was. And like much of what we do in research, and once we found out about this, there was a lot of action toward change. Um, and in 1974, the National Research Act was created. This act made a commission that was to basically establish ethical principles for human subjects research, both in the biomedical and behavioral fields. Um, so from that, these folks worked together to create what's called the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report was finalized in 1978. And here we have fundamental principles guiding human subjects research. And these three principles were as follows. The first is called respect for persons. Um, this this principle highlights that people have autonomy, and they have the right to be able to join or not join your research study based on their own volition. Because of this, we have protections for people who have diminished autonomy. Like you can't just do studies on imprisoned people as a convenient sample. The research you do, if it's on imprisoned people, has to be on things like the conditions of prisons, things to improve these folks' quality of life, or to rehabilitate them so that when they're no longer in prison, they can enter back into society. Um, there is diminished autonomy among children, among people with diminished cognitive abilities. And so these folks get special protections because of their diminished autonomy. One concept that came out of this principle of respect for persons is informed consent. And you can think of this as a process. It's not just a document you sign, and people voluntarily agree to be in your study or not. Consent can change throughout the course of the study. So one example of this, let me pull it up here. If you give me just a second. Sorry about this. I thought I had already had it pulled up, and it will take me just a moment to get this going. I'm going to pull up an informed consent document from one of my studies. Okay. I'm going to just pause the recording for a second. Okay, so we're going to start our recording here again. So here you can see an example of a informed consent document from research that's going on in my lab. This was a study that was done online, and participants were recruited from our SONA website and from a website called Prolific. Um, and here this is supposed to be telling you about all the details of the study, risks and discomforts that you might encounter during the study, and how you uh, can get in touch with student counseling if anything about this study makes you feel uncomfortable. It also tells you about how your data are going to be treated, where they're going to be kept, and how they'll be kept confidential, um, where you can participate in the study, and then some of the benefits of participating in the study. Um, it also has contact information of the researcher, that's me, and basically everything that you need to know to be informed about this study. So this is a really useful document, but you can see that informed consent is not just a document, it's an entire process. And the idea is that participants are adequately informed about what they're going to be doing in the research. The second concept, principle that came out of the Belmont report is called beneficence. This is more of an obligation, and there's two general rules. Don't do harm to your participants, and we should maximize possible benefits to reduce any potential harms that come out of the research that we're doing. One concept that's kind of tricky is around deception, though. There's really two reasons that deception can be against the Belmont report. One is maybe it's harmful to participants, altogether. Nobody likes being lied to or deceived. And also, one other thing is that it goes against respect for persons, because people are not adequately informed about all the details of the study. They're deceived. So would these participants have entered into this study had they known that it was going to be about this topic instead of another topic? So one thing we know from the Milgram study, this classic study in which participants were assigned to a teacher role in giving shocks to a learner who was not actually receiving these shocks, unbeknownst to the participant. And people were assessed on whether or not the deception in the study was harmful. Um, and what was really harmful to them was that they were being evaluated in a negative way. They were upset that they had done something terrible by giving people shocks. Um, whereas being deceived was not so much what upset them. And participants seemed to understand that deception was necessary in the study. So can we offer benefits when participants are upset about the way that they've behaved? Incentives like SONA credits are not benefits. And instead, you might be offering benefits to societies. So we would not be able to study these things without deception. And perhaps the information that we're collecting from the study, it can benefit society. Um, there's also things like, information about the participant that you can provide to them that might be useful. And there is perhaps if you're doing some kind of intervention study that's helpful to people, maybe just by virtue of being assigned to that intervention, they might see some benefits. But you can't just pay them more money. And in fact, um, money as an incentive is actually more associated with a risk than it is as a benefit. The third principle is referred to as justice. The people who receive the benefits and are burdened by participating in the research um, should be the ones who receive its benefits. Um, this is another reason why you can't just do research on imprisoned people for convenience. Perhaps everybody is going to be benefited from this research and not just people who are imprisoned. So this is why if you're doing research on folks who are imprisoned, um, it needs to be on topics like the conditions of the prison, or in other words, the people who are burdened by participating should be the ones who benefit from it. Of the many unethical things that came out of the Tuskegee trials, uh, one threat to justice here was that only Black men were involved in this study, and instead, syphilis is a disease that can affect anybody. So only this subset of the population was burdened by participating in the research, while society was receiving all of its benefits. Um, so this would be a violation of justice. Of course, there were many other things. I'm going to skip over this example here because I've already given a couple of other examples. So another thing that came out of this was the creation of something called institutional review boards. These are committees at an institution. We have one here at Radford that reviews research procedures. Institutional review boards are required to have a chair and at least 5 members who are field experts or experts in their subdiscipline. Um, and it also has to require a community member who is an expert at research. So um, we might be recruiting folks from hospitals who are not involved with Radford or Carilion so that they can be the community representative. And it has a couple duties. The first is identifying if protocols that have been submitted by faculty or researchers at an institution are even research at all. And this has two categories, or two requirements rather. One is that you're collecting information from human participants, and also it's that you're doing so to create generalizable knowledge. Okay, so it has to have those two things. So just because I'm doing an assessment about the quality of our psychology major does not mean that that's research, because we're not trying to generalize that. And then most importantly, our job is to review protocols of research being conducted at the institution and assess whether or not this research is compliant with the Belmont report. What we don't do, we don't review methods. Um, we're not, we have no business in looking over people's research methods, unless, of course, the methods are done so poorly that uh, we can say that the study will actually, not be beneficial to anybody or society at all. Um, and this is why we have to have discipline experts from many different fields on the IRB. So on our IRB, which I serve on, we have psychologists, we have sociologists, we have folks from criminal justice, we have folks from nursing, and from Carillion. There's a lot of different folks from different areas on the task of identifying these things. So we do look at methods, but usually it's just the discipline expert who will say, this study is not designed well, and then the committee can make determinations about its suitability to be done. We also have responsibilities to our community and to the field as scientists. It doesn't stop at our participants. And we're beholden to the community. My salary is funded by taxpayers. I pay taxes too. So I am responsible to the community who is giving me a job. Um, so let's take a look at this guy here. There's a reading this week on Diederik Stapel. It's a really interesting read uh, from a magazine that came out in 2012, I think. Um, but what this guy was doing was he was a very well-funded Dutch researcher, and we came to find out that he was fabricating data from the research that he was publishing. Fabrication means he's basically just making it up. And this is obviously not something that is ethical. Um, we our relationship with our community is really reliant on trust that we scientists are going to do uh, uh, our studies honestly, and Diederik here was not. So there's some pretty clearly, um, you know, black and white. These are one is wrong and one is right types of decisions that we can make. So some things that you can't come back from are things like plagiarism. This does not necessarily mean that you're just copying words from somebody else. Plagiarism refers to falsely representing another person's work as your own. And I think we're all probably familiar with that. I'm going to skip over this example here. Another type of unethical behavior is called falsification. This is when you manipulate your research materials or your equipment or your data recording process. You might change or omit data. And so your results are not accurately represented in the research record. So this might be maybe deleting a few participants who don't behave in a way that confirms your hypothesis. This is another non-negotiable no-no in science. you can't falsify your materials or your data. And then the third thing that we can't do in science is fabrication, and this is the Stoppel example that I just showed you. Um, so we are beholden to our community to make sure that these behaviors are not occurring from researchers in the field. But there are some other things that we need to be aware of. These are called questionable research practices. They're not objectively right or wrong. And what they do is uh, they challenge the truthfulness of your science. Or in other words, they make your data and your findings look less strong. So they're not necessarily bad or good, um, but they happen, and it makes people question the strength of your science. So one example of this might be not publishing results um, in your that you've collected. And this might be because maybe they're null results, or in other words, they didn't turn out, or they're the opposite of what you would expected. And what's so bad about this is that uh, people might be using uh, data to make decisions about things like policy, and or health, things like that. And if you have findings that say the opposite of that, that you can't get published, um, then the public won't have access to that. Or in other words, they might not be fully informed. Now, file drawing is not necessarily intentional. I've got tons of studies that I've been trying to publish for, a long time, and it's just really hard to get them into journals when they come up as the opposite of what you predicted. Um, they might ask you to go back and replicate those results. So it's not like I'm intentionally keeping studies in my file drawer and not publishing them. So this is a questionable practice. It's not like it's necessarily right or wrong, but it can have major consequences because it keeps people from accessing all of the information that is out there. Another example of questionable research practices is p-hacking. This is a family of statistical practices where you might do something like try out multiple statistical tests, and then you only report the one that gives you the significant result. Or you run analyses with covariates in a statistical model, and that inflates your significance. And there's all sorts of different things that can happen. And the big problem here is if it's not disclosed. These are practices are questionable whether you disclose them or not, but it really becomes a problem if they're not disclosed. If you tell people about them, they can look at your results and go, I don't know if I trust that very much. So some examples of p-hacking came up from a researcher who does work um, on health and consumer behavior. Brian Wansink, who did research on things like, looking at uh, how much calories you purchase at the grocery store, um, if you shop when you're hungry. He's had many papers retracted because he was participating in p-hacking, and there's a really interesting BuzzFeed article where he was all found out about it. Um, another research field that has been looked at is the concept of power posing, done by a researcher named Amy Cuddy. This one was not quite as bad. She was collecting data until it reached significance, and there's some problems with that if we do it. Um, Power posing is a real thing. The problem is that it was not really based on high quality science. If you just collect data until your p-value is statistically significant, those data might not be stable. Or in other words, if you recruited like five more participants, that effect might go away. And it tends to inflate effect sizes. And so where do we go from here? Or how do we get around issues of, um, p-hacking and questionable research practices? One way is by pre-registering your studies before you do them. Or in other words, you lock in your hypotheses and make all of your materials public. You essentially tell people what you're going to do before you do it. And I'll share access with a website where I've done just this, um, called the Open Science Framework. Here, I locked in my hypotheses under this registration. Just to show you how locked in this is, I had meant to put a hyphen here and I accidentally mistyped it as an equal to symbol. And for folks who are interested, they can click on this and they can actually go see my hypotheses and everything, that I was going to do, how I was going to score my measures, kind of like how you all are doing for your lab assignment 4, where you're making us aware of all the materials that you're going to be using. So that's one way that we can help people to be a little bit more honest about their work is by having them pre-register their findings. Um, Another way is by making your data public so that people can reproduce your results. Um, so there might be cases though where you're using deception where this is tricky. For example, if we do deception in research, we give people the option to remove their data from the study at the end, if they so choose, because they didn't know the full nature of the study when they entered into it. Um, and the downside to this is that maybe the other researchers who are interested in your work can't reproduce your findings because not all the data is there. Some other downsides to this or uh, challenges to sharing your data are if people have specific knowledge about the uh, population that you sampled from. So let's say that they knew that they were psychology majors at Radford. Well, what happens if you're the only like Filipino student, for example, and demographic information is included in these data? Um, then somebody with reasonable knowledge of that institution would know who that student is. Um, so you can see how challenging this might become. One final way that you can increase trust in your science is by replicating the work. And replication is a really challenging effort, because scientists are not incentivized for doing replication work. We're supposed to be creating novel research findings. So one way around that is we do these crowdsourcing replication studies, and you can see I'm one of our authors here on this study, um, where we, grouped together and we replicated several studies in psychology. So these are just a few things that you can do to increase trust in science, and we're working very hard at thinking through more of these. There's going to be another lecture on this later on in the semester that you'll watch next week on even better approaches to this. All right, folks, we'll see you in class.